after lunch. So first, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. It's my first time in Knoxville, and it's beautiful here. So security as a product. Security is a product, but we treat it more like a secret, immutable grail to preserve, unblemished by the sublunary needs of users. And yet we wonder why defense remains stagnant, while we fail so consistently in progressing towards the glorious ideal of a secure organization, whatever that means. We'll continue to fail unless we treat security as a product. Are we trying to respect the phantasmal elder deities of InfoSec and their stringent doctrine? Or are we trying to ensure our organization can still thrive while operating in a perilous digital world? One definition of a product I prefer is something created through a process that provides benefits to a market. Security as a product, therefore, is created through a process and it benefits a market, which is your organization. The somewhat religious belief I hear espoused is that designing security to benefit your organization will result in some sort of blasphemous mimicry of true security, but that couldn't be further from the truth. It's a mimicry of your duty as a defender to follow your personal beliefs rather than pursue strategies that benefit your organization. Maybe right now you're like really skeptical, you're feeling good from lunch, you don't believe me. You think there's some level of objective truth that it's foolish to discard in the name of benefiting your organization. Whatever that truth is, that's now your product. And if it doesn't benefit your organization, you're basically attempting to sell a product into a market that doesn't actually want it. I'm often left a little perplexed at how some security professionals can see victory in forcing through a change that users viscerally dislike, as if their dissatisfaction is some sort of like cool blood sacrifice. I personally don't think that could possibly be success. Success is solving a real problem in a way that delivers consistent value. Success is fostering consensus so that you're supported by your organization through meaningful change, even if it's painful. Even if you implement something that's adding to your customer's burden, for example, the requirement for multi-round hashing rather than storing creds in plain text, they must be included and they have to understand the significance and the value and the need for their noble sacrifice. You'll fail if the security of your organization rests on users adopting a strategy that neither provides them value nor is one they support. The other day, Sari Jamie Lewis, who's a security researcher, tweeted, "Our software is secure if you use it correctly means our software is not secure." Similarly, your organization is secure as long as users follow your security policies to the letter. Your organization is not secure. Maintaining the dogmatic view that the users must be wrong within your organization, rather than accepting the situation for what it is, the failure of your security program, is why we continue to fail. How many more years are we going to lament that our users report security before we actually start working on pragmatic solutions? Pragmatism doesn't require security sacrilege. All products, including security, are shared problems within an organization. Each stakeholder must feel they have a personal stake in whatever the course of action is that's taken, a process that's called building consensus. As a product manager, I've had a bunch of times, including recently, where you'll be releasing changes or new features that may be contentious. It may impact your end users. If I pursue a strategy without regard for how my colleagues, the ones interacting with the customers, will be affected and how they'll feel, the product won't succeed in the market because they won't be confident in it. They won't have the confidence to sell it. If I come to my colleagues with evidence for why it is necessary, describe how it works in the broader product vision, and actively listen to their concerns, we can design a strategy collectively in which all parties are confident, even in the face of uncomfortable change. Security as a product doesn't require the wearing down of strategies through compromise until they're rendered ineffective. It requires a purposeful strategy through an overarching vision of how security can support the organization's survival in light of the fact that computers are frankly somewhat garbage, but necessary for success in our modern age. At this point, I feel like I've mastered the perfect blank-faced expression for when security professionals very nonchalantly explain the improvisational nature of their security strategy making. Most assume I'm asking whether they have a strategy for a specific project, let's say, implementing some sort of AppSec tool. And they seem surprised when I ask if they've defined a longer-term vision for their overall security program. Sometimes they look blankly if I even mention an overall security program. In the same conversation, the CISO or security engineer or security architect with whom I'm speaking will unleash a very fiery and passionate rant. Perhaps you've heard some of these grievances or uttered them yourself. things do sometimes sort of get accomplished, but slowly. We don't ever actually make progress, we're just running around. We keep making the same mistakes over and over. It doesn't get better. I don't have any time to do research. I'm constantly in meetings where we don't actually get anything done. I just don't even give a shit anymore. Nothing changes. I really do feel for your plight, but it can get very, very tedious after a while. There's clearly something amiss here that better or more tech or better or more people can't fix. They'll simply be likewise wasted. I hear these remonstrances nearly everywhere in InfoSec, from the smallest of teams to frankly Fortune 500s or even Fortune 100s, sprawling over multiple functional areas. There are countless passionate people in our industry that are working tirelessly who consistently feel like they aren't accomplishing anything that is meaningfully improving security. What's perhaps even worse is hearing that security teams have adopted agile methodology. Then I'll discover that their tasks are based on the whims of the individual performing the tasks, or their epics are ill-defined and based on functional areas, and no one is ever looking at the higher level of what resources are being used towards what projects. What's even more jarring is when I play this sort of like surrogate therapist and listening to their day-to-day plight, I'll ask probing questions to try to figure out why the teams are so inefficient at a macro level. They somewhat unabashedly disclose that their teams don't have any overarching goals defined, let alone metrics to track progress. Then we remain shocked that we aren't progressing. Of the three pillars of InfoSec, which are considered people, processes, and technology, I believe processes are most ignored and undervalued. I've grown, frankly, exhausted, probably you have too, by the amount of articles about the cyber skills shortage. I've even spoken about this, the somewhat pernicious complexity and misguidedness of the security technology space, which was on show at RSA earlier this year. Yet I don't really see the same volume of fiery headlines and hot takes on Twitter about how processes are failing us, despite the fact that processes are the underpinnings of how people work together with people and how they work together with technology. As an example from my work, I've actually been amazed what our customers can accomplish with Excel in like 2 people. They can manage a vendor risk program over thousands and thousands of vendors with just that. But a trait in common with all those customers is that despite their people and technology constraints, they can very easily articulate their process and their methodology. It's because they've comprehensively defined it. A process is a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. You can have the best people and the best technology, but if you can't define to what end they're working, how can they be used, and success is unlikely to manifest. You also have to determine the what before the how. It's prohibitive to determine the steps necessary until you define what the particular end should be. I believe there's insufficient attention paid in security programs to what particular ends are. It's just, oh yeah, making company Inc. secure really the best that we can do as far as defining security goals. The foundation for any product is to understand the goal for the product. Fundamentally, what is the product's purpose? What are you trying to help users accomplish? Viewing security as a product forces you to define goals and come to terms with your team's purpose. It also ensures you're prioritizing actions appropriately, honing in on what will actually improve the product and your customer's experience. If your company is publicly traded, or even if it has competitors that are publicly traded, have you read their annual report? Can you summarize the risk factors they outline in their 10K, which is an SEC required document? The risk factors section is literally a cheat sheet. They will stack rank the list of risks that they think are most material to their business. If you don't understand the risk to your business's ongoing operations from the organization's perspective of priority, how can you possibly understand what is most essential to protect? I assure you, you don't have to dive too deeply into the world of product management in order to improve your security program. The aforementioned rants by some of my friends that are on blue teams are painful primarily because they include examples of what you definitely shouldn't do in product management. You want to continuously create successful products. So even just not doing those things will show progress, let alone doing the right things. What lurks beneath the frustration, I think, expressed by so many in our industry is ultimately a sense of helplessness. We don't feel empowered, we feel stifled and downtrodden. I would argue in any profession where you expend a lot of intellectual effort and time capital into improving a problem, only to feel like you're running in place, you'll see a lot of burnout. In InfoSec, despite a common understanding that reactive approaches in defense are misguided, we maintain reactive processes. Security teams are accustomed to receiving direction externally, feeling burdened with priorities that defy their beliefs of what is important, as if some sort of secular organization like capitalistic business could dictate the priorities of such a sacred order as security. Once you adopt the mindset of security as a product, you can begin to take control. One of the basics of product management is that solely delivering exactly what the customers demand or ask for without understanding the motivation behind their demands will lead to poor outcomes and potentially monstrously disjointed user experiences that are basically customized with individual features for each individual customer. You have to proactively understand your customer's perspective and look beneath the surface of what they're requesting to discern the underlying challenge or desire. How many of you here have worked in retail or food service or another service job? A lot of you. I have two. I worked at a department store and then a froyo shop. And I think if security people think they're treated badly, they've never worked in one of those jobs because, oh my gosh, it's awful. But on the happier experience, which is the department store rather than cleaning up froyo thrown by a 3-year-old, one method by which I sold higher SKU merchandise was by learning a bit about the individual customer. I asked questions about why they were shopping and what frustrates them sartorially speaking. Most of the time my customers were women. Generally they were preparing for an event, a date, a gala, whatever else. I listened carefully to pick up any clues that could indicate their challenges. For example, one to which I deeply relate are I hate wearing dresses, or I'm going to be on my feet all night and I'm going to feel uncomfortable. Even a morsel of that sort of data was enough for me to find additional options for them beyond the items that they chose. Perhaps a dress with pockets and elastic waist for any of the dress wearers here, like that looks chic while maximizing comfort. But there's also the benefit of, for example, a maxi dress. So if you don't know what one of those is, it's one of the ones that reaches the floor, but it's not a formal gown. Benefit there is you can actually wear flats and no one knows, so it still looks fancy even though your feet are comfortable. So I'm aware that I'm basically describing a really robust recommendation engine. I think humans can excel in that effort too. It's not just Netflix. Amazon's is pretty bad. So let's stick with Netflix. But I think all of us can agree we had some sort of office fairy godparent anticipating our needs and then making our lives easier, all without having to request or nag. We'd be pretty happy. Afforded the cover, because I'm a product manager, of not being strictly speaking a security professional, I can attest that security teams are frequently considered the exact opposite of this, something like some sort of sulking demon that seems to relish like making their lives as hard as possible and decrees that you're forbidden from whatever you need to do to get your job done, seemingly not even caring about what those things are. Security teams both rely primarily on direction, yet also resent this dependence. But ironically, when I speak to security professionals, they also begrudge the notion of reaching out proactively to their organization's stakeholders to discern what needs to be done. This inconsistency of thinking leads me to somewhat believe that what many security people want is to dictate what's important to the company from a security perspective based on their own opinions, so as to serve what I call the elder infosec deities. Frankly, it sometimes takes considerable effort not to have my best, like Regina George, mean girl, like, ugh, face, after listening to them kind of opine about their blue team utopia, or bluetopia, as I call it, with friends. And then ask pointedly, like, have you considered that your opinions might be wrong? Part of the reason is I don't really need help in being socially awkward, and that would just amplify it a lot. But the larger part is I also don't think they would be that deterred, even if their opinions are called wrong. My conclusion is this is because of what I call the Steve Jobs myth. For full disclosure, I really don't like Steve Jobs. I think he was a jerk, and I think he was a really wretched role model for leadership on a variety of levels. But I do recognize that he tends to be idolized by the type of people that prioritize their personal opinion over what their organization actually needs. It's because of the Steve Jobs myth. The myth is that through the spellbinding magic of, Jobs' gut instinct, defying all user evidence, market research, whatever else, Apple forged ahead with the iPhone and completely revolutionized the way we do anything. That's not what actually happened. What actually happened is there was an experimental project initiated without his knowledge, which received lukewarm reception by him once it was presented to him because he thought cell phones sucked. But he trusted the team to work through all the technical details and allowed the head of the project to actually hire other engineers within Apple to work on it. What he insisted in return was seeing an interface that is intuitive and exciting to lay users, not tech geeks, before he'd be convinced. So the Steve Jobs myth perpetuates the idea that jobs give minimal thought to user needs, which generally means that some people feel empowered not to care about other people's needs either. And I think it's the only way to possibly conceive brilliance and leave users truly awestruck. Jobs' concern was actually that you can't simply ask people, hey, what's the best next big thing? Like, what would you really want to buy next? And that market research is insufficient to conceive a product that customers will love. He did, however, view user research as essential, as seen as his requirement for the iPhone. What he understood is people don't always say, or frankly even know, what they want. But through user research, you can see which preferences they truly hold based on how they behave. Within behavioral economics, which if you've seen or read any of my talks, obviously I focus on it a lot, there's a very clear hierarchy between stated versus revealed preferences. Humans can be proficient in fooling themselves and what their preferences are, or if they're being interviewed, they want a safe face. So as a self-deprecating example, someone asked me, are you more inclined to have like a wonderful, chicken and broccoli, spinach dinner during the week, or a can of tuna like sloppily mixed with mayo? I'm not inclined to necessarily reveal that I have a lot of similar behaviors to a cat, right? So I'm going to answer chicken and broccoli and spinach. And that's my ideal self in mind. But if you actually observe the dinners I made, it's like a can of tuna, sometimes without the mayo if I've forgotten to pick it up, or just not even dinner if I'm super busy. And that's a vastly firmer source of truth of what I would actually do than what I say. For an example from InfoSec, if you ask people in your organization, do you find SSO easy to use? You may discover a variety of answers. Maybe they answer yes, because they don't want to feel less intelligent by not finding it easy. Or they use it so infrequently, for whatever reason they just don't use technology or their services in your organization, they've forgotten the frustration they had the last time they did use it. Maybe they answer no, because in a customer meeting an hour ago it totally screwed their demo and now they're really, really mad. You might even find that people's answers will switch one week to the next, depending on what their most recent experiences have been. You can examine revealed preferences instead, looking for the number of customer support tickets related to SSO, the number of multiple push notifications, like if someone's requesting a push notification like 20 times in 1 minute, it's probably not working right for them, the number of password reset requests, or how many people re-entered the URL of the service after being directed to the SSO page. These metrics are more likely to tell the truth of how users actually view and are actually hindered or helped by SSO. Another issue arising from the so-called jobs myth is that believers of it use it to justify proceeding with their projects, generally with the assumption that, oh yeah, the users will learn to love it, because they believe Jobs' ideas were so productive and out there and progressive that even if users didn't love it at first, they would grow to love it because they would see the vision. That's also thoroughly inaccurate. As Jobs himself stated, you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out where to sell it. Simply because you personally believe something is valuable or important doesn't mean it is. You have to understand the problems that are actually meaningful and work backwards to how to solve them. This isn't just an issue with blue teams, it's a symptom of kind of the InfoSec market as a whole, particularly InfoSec startups. It's the classic blunder of creating a hammer in search of a nail. Your job is not to determine priorities in kind of this sandbox mind space and convince the organization that securing something is of vital importance when it doesn't actually present material business risk. Your job is to determine priorities based on what veritably helps the organization and explain why your solution is the right one to help them. An extension of this fallacy is also the reverse, that security people can be presented with a valid solution to the organization's problem, but reject it because they personally don't believe the problem is important. So as a real-world example, somewhat recently, a security professional I know pushed for a specific product to be purchased in their organization. They presented the 4-figure cost, which is, for security products, that's pretty good, and offered a variety of use cases where it could be used throughout their organization, such as simplifying the ability for engineers to implement early detection and warning systems in the company's infrastructure. They shopped the idea around to non-security people groups on its usefulness and gained their buy-in as well. However, the person in charge of procurement, security procurement specifically, held the personal opinion that this type of product isn't useful and constantly pushed back on the request. Again, a 4-figure request versus the typical 6-figure blinky boxes we see. I see this so regularly and hear about it so regularly that I began calling it security morals, but I now really think it should be called security dogma. What I mean by that specifically is that there are somewhat rigid principles common among security professionals that are treated as dogma. As aforementioned, there's a seemingly insatiable desire to satisfy the elder InfoSec deities by strictly adhering to their doctrine, as if it defies the organization, or even if it defies the organization's needs. In a SaaS product, for example, if an engineer refuses to add a print button because they personally think it's useless because you can just right-click and hit print, despite user research showing that everybody's confused about how to actually print the page, their personal opinion will be demoted in favor of the concrete evidence. If they did this regularly enough, they'd probably be placed on a performance plan. Security similar behavior almost seems rewarded, as if performance is measured by how steadfast your belief is in the security dogma and how rigidly you adhere to the security morals. Such behavior wouldn't be rewarded if you viewed security as a product. When speaking with defenders, I notice a non-trivial amount bristle at the notion of even having customers, that there is some sort of neutral force above the fray akin to the Federal Reserve. It was in thinking through why so many defenders hate the concept of having customers that my notion of the security dogma really solidified, that their principles of security treated as incontrovertibly true and mandatory to implement regardless of the reality of the organization, what determines the organization's fortunes, or what endangers its continuing operations. Security professionals may view themselves as some sort of like heroic knight, but to others in the organization, they're going to come across like some really freaky and really weird Knights Templar. As in the trope, even minor security offenses will be treated as super critical. Everything's really high priority. Enforcing justice is paramount and unnegotiable, and an egotistical complex emergence of interpreting any resistance to your so-called noble intentions as evidence of principles in need of correction. While you're not, in fact, a knight, although I would also like to be a knight, you do have the opportunity to be some sort of kind of small-scale hero. But it's not by rescuing someone who is not actually in distress just because you believe they need rescuing. Again, to stress, your customer is your organization. Imagine if you attempted to order food in an app and it told you no because it thought the food was like insufficiently healthy, but they never really explained what healthy means and what those metrics are. Would you enjoy the app? I would be pretty pissed at it. I mean, I might begrudgingly admit like they had a point about like midnight pizza, but I still wouldn't enjoy it and probably use something else. This is more though than not being likable, it's also about respect. Likability isn't necessary for being effective. You need to be respected instead. If you're perceived as dogmatic, I promise you that you will not engender the respect you need to be effective. I'm usually a bit astonished at how little security teams work on cultivating organizational buy-in, since it's a core part of my job as a product manager. Like, I would not be able to ever release a product without it. I personally also believe that a security program can't really succeed without it. That doesn't mean everything becomes watered down and, clear text creds are totally fine. That's not the case. You don't need to have perfect agreement. Instead, it means ensuring that the organization feels as if it's a stakeholder in security, that it's along for the journey, that security is not their adversary, but a fellow team attempting to better the organization, just like they are. You could actually never implement things that they ask for or request or propose, and still foster a sense of consensus just by presenting your point of view with some sort of sense of empathy. I personally struggled with empathy often. I think in InfoSec, a lot of people are somewhere on the spectrum, as am I, so practicing empathy can feel a bit unnatural, but I assure you it's not impossible. Like, if I can do it, you can definitely do it. And your job will also become substantially easier when you really actively listen to people and ensure you're understanding their point of view, rather than trying to dismiss them and just ram your point of view down their throat. Active listening in general, I think, is one of the most useful life skills, so I recommend Googling it. But cultivating customer empathy is the first step you should really take in transitioning security to a product. Example method is the 5 whys. Some of you may be familiar with this. The goal is to dig deeper into why something is a problem and identify its root causes. You may have done it on the technical side before. But as an example, why don't you want to implement two-factor authentication for Salesforce? Why do you not want to add a step for salespeople to log into Salesforce? Why can't the salespeople afford the additional time? Why do salespeople need to log their call notes immediately after a call? Why do salespeople need to transfer notes from Google Docs to Salesforce? The root cause is arguably that there is friction between the notes salespeople take during the call and when they're meant to log the call. The solution might be to integrate Google Docs into Salesforce, meaning the user has to only log in one service during the course of the work, which also means that implementing two-factor will be a lot more palatable. As in this case, you may hear answers that don't actually seem like they're security related and thus are irrelevant to you. But your role is to connect the dots between business operations and the security risks that threaten them. I strongly believe that your highest value as a security professional is perhaps in emphasizing what the organization's business risk and then identifying where digital risks arise that amplify or solidify that business risk. Your customer knows what endangers their operations and their longevity as a business, but they don't know how that danger manifests in the digital domain. Once you feel you truly understand where customers are struggling, you can begin architecting your vision. Consider your vision for your security program as its story that will unfold over time. Themes serve as the heart of stories. If any of you took English, you probably always had to analyze themes. Maybe you hate it, but they do serve as kind of the anchor for stories. They're the foundation for the central idea the author is attempting to convey. The plot or the events that unfold within the story support the theme and then carry the story towards its goal. In a security as a product model, you will also have themes. Those themes will also have plots, courses of work that drive towards the goal. And there are actions that you need to take for those courses of work. Before defining any of the work, however, you have to envision the overarching story. Few people are naturally proficient storytellers. I don't necessarily think I'm one of them. But one thing I do like doing, I like being a little cheeky and cheesy and getting a little wild and crazy with things. So you can create this sort of weird fairy tale narrative for your security program. So here's one of mine. The dawn of the year, our band of heroes embarked on their quest to Engineersville. They heard the cries from the local farmers of meager yields and slow harvests due to bugs. Imagine it's like Geralt of Rivia or something, like in one of the very muddy towns. It would not simply suffice for the heroes to kill all bugs as they appeared. After all, there are many quests elsewhere to complete. They knew their noble purpose was now to help the farmers ensure a bountiful, efficient harvest that they could sustain on their own. Our hero's first goal was to reduce the amount of time it took to squash bugs spotted in the fields, as the bugs could hurt the harvest if they were left alive. Come spring's first blossom, our heroes transitioned to their second goal, ensuring fewer bugs were being introduced into the crops. They helped the locals map out how their field architecture would look ahead of planting to determine where bugs could spring up. As summer began sizzling, they toiled to ensure that their tools could be used by the locals as well, not just the heroes. Beginning the work on crafting one master tool that locals could use that would automatically determine which of the specialized tools was best for reducing bugs and the types of fields being sown. The first leaves of autumn fell. Our heroes tested this magical tool among a small group of locals, carefully analyzing results and finally releasing it to all of the locals so that they could begin their next year empowered to have a bug-free harvest. This also meant the heroes would have to do even less work of patching and helping locals tend to their fields, allowing them to focus on new quests. A wizard hat is obviously optional, but recommended if you're doing this, and it can be a fun team exercise. So in that story, are there really any security principles being violated or sacrificed? The overarching goal is to reduce the number of vulnerabilities in production, ultimately. As in this story, there may be multiple themes that are part of the same story. Reducing the mean time to fix vulnerabilities, adding threat modeling in the design phase to introduce fewer bugs, and creating an automated tool that abstracts multiple security products away from the engineer so they can test their code easily and efficiently during development. The goal is still fundamentally a security goal, but the themes show customer empathy. The engineers want minimal friction in their workflows. As close as you can ever get to like push button get security, they will absolutely love it. Your team as a stakeholder is also not ignored in this. The two initial themes are enablers to the longer-term goal, reducing the current workload off of your team to support progress toward an even more efficient solution that will reduce workloads further. It's essential to view it as a full story and not be disheartened that your end goal can't be accomplished immediately. Setting themes and dreaming up your vision can inspire you so fully, perhaps, that you find yourself with a full cornucopia of ideas. But unless you're exceptionally fortunate, you won't have the resources necessary to pursue all of those different ideas. So you have to prioritize them. And prioritization is one of those tasks that's really easy to say and really, really hard to do in practice. When I build roadmaps in my work, a lot of times I'll put a ton of stuff on the page and I'll have to really think when it gets down to the this or that decision that requires you to push back work on something that still would really benefit customers, just not as much as the other thing. My first word of caution to you in this is avoiding prioritizing things based on what you feel is most important. Waging a war of opinions is one in which everyone loses. That's ultimately what you will be doing, unless you prefer a dictatorship style, if you use your personal views for prioritization. Instead, you again have to return to the perspective of your customer. While you may personally believe that the theme of reducing the volume of emails with malicious attachments is the most important one, your organization may have their deployment frequency and lead time metrics currently hampered by security measures, which more tangibly affects business performance. How do you differentiate which themes to prioritize? You collect and analyze data, both qualitative and quantitative. A good engineering program will already be tracking metrics such as availability, customer tickets, deployment frequency, error rates, lead time, mean time to detection, MTDD, mean time to recovery, MTDR, mean time to failure. There's some contention there, so I won't cover that. But basically ask engineering how those metrics are being impacted by security requirements today. Similarly, if you aren't tracking metrics in your own program, you really should be, because it's necessary for measuring progress in a product. That includes your own MTDD and MTDR, such as how quickly you remediate product security tickets. It should also include measuring the frequency of configuration management changes, such as firewall rules updates, patching, hardening, anything that measures the tempo of your program. You can also measure how resources, specifically your security team's time, are being used. Are they spending half of their time extinguishing fires? Is a third of their day or a third of their month dedicated to working on your SIEM and maintaining it? Do they lose a week each month asking routine questions that they repeat over and over to threat model with the engineering teams? These all represent opportunities for automation, as there's benefit in reducing the cost of your recurring security tasks and freeing up resources for more impactful streams of work to your organization. You should also poll how your team wants to spend their time, to ensure you retain your talent and you avoid needing to worry about the pipeline problem in the first place. Beyond this, you also need to quantitatively measure how your organization perceives the efficacy of your program. If you're familiar with NPS, that's Net Promoter Scores, it's pretty simple. You ask the customer, like, rate me 0 to 10, and then there's a fancy calculation that then shows like how many more promoters you have than detractors. So conduct the equivalent of NPS surveys for the security organization, where teams who frequently interact with the security rate how satisfied they are with the security program. I'd recommend keeping them anonymous, because security people can frankly be a little scary and they don't want to like have you hack them if they say something bad about your program. Quantitative data doesn't always tell the full picture though. Qualitative data helps fill in detail and may even expose concerns that are difficult to discern from quantitative data. Talk with a selection of individuals across different roles and levels in your organization to hear their feedback on how security can better meet the needs of their work. You should also ask people on your team, not just senior people, also junior people, to get their feedback as well. Again, anonymous surveys can be your friends, means people are more likely to be honest. My security fairy tale above could be an example of hitting the nexus of what your data is telling you, which would thus rise in priority. Let's say your engineers are dissatisfied with having to wrestle with security testing products themselves and their lead time to deploy is suffering. Half of your security products team is spent on patching and last-minute security testing before GA. Probably some of you have dealt with like a development team being like, oh yeah, we're releasing tomorrow, can you do a security root? Which like no one wants that for everyone. And that would be because engineering finds it too onerous right now to actually conduct it earlier in the process. And maybe you have 3 product security people making, let's say, I don't know, 100,000 each, they're pretty well paid, and you're spending then $12,500 a month on something the customer doesn't like anyway. Perhaps as a last data point, your product security team has expressed the desire to do more research and build custom tools. A project then to build a custom tool that lets engineers self-serve their security testing in the development process and to standardize a threat model for the design stage would tangibly improve all of the data points you collected. It also happens to be straightforward to measure, which makes the likelihood of success even greater, since you can more easily determine like which aspects of the product aren't working. There are also a few economic angles to consider here. First is opportunity cost. By supporting legacy technology with time and money, from what else are you taking away resources? Some of my favorite CISOs share, coincidentally or not, the trait of thinking about their programs in terms of mostly monetary costs of work. This importantly includes pricing the total cost of a security product, which includes the amount of time spent on maintenance, tuning, tweaking, and troubleshooting that your team will have to perform on an ongoing basis. When I did like a very like non-scientific and informal Twitter poll asking about maintenance costs of different security tools, I had assumed that the most would be 35 hours per month, So I just had a 35-hour plus thing, and everyone who was using a SEAM answered 35 plus hours a month. Like, are you including that in your evaluation of whether to renew with that product and that total cost? Any expenditure of effort by your security team on an action is directly taking away your ability to invest in another action. The second is the sunk cost fallacy, with which some of you may be familiar. Just because you've invested a lot of time and money into something already doesn't mean it's still worth pursuing. Throwing strong resources at weak purposes will deteriorate your product. As in the aforementioned example of opportunity cost, a legacy security product requires substantial ongoing maintenance to perform as you need. Prioritizing a theme of moving to newer, less burdensome products may be necessary. While this may add some sort of short-term resource sink, it will allow the plot in your story to ultimately move forward rather than stagnate. But the product management process doesn't stop once themes have been prioritized. It has to be stressed that any security initiatives will inherently be shared due to their nature of affecting the organization. Your customer has to be brought along in the journey, feel like they have a stake in your story. When you're soliciting that feedback I mentioned from other people, it's an opportunity to grow a working relationship and ultimately to engender trust. Rather than mixing their ideas on the spot, which is frankly a huge temptation of mine, but again, I promise if I can do it, you can definitely hold your tongue too. If you don't think they're worthwhile, use language like, oh, I hadn't considered that, my team will have to look into it. You don't want to promise that all suggestions will actually be implemented or you'll result in a lot of disappointed people, but you do want to make people feel like they've been heard. And if you do end up implementing something that they suggested or requested or that meets their pain point, they're going to be really happy with you. Also be transparent in your story. To start, determine who the right stakeholders are in each organization and ask if you just bring coffee or donuts or something else when you present your story to them. Ask them what they think of it. Are there any assumptions with which they disagree? Are there any risks that haven't been captured? How do they feel it will impact them? Ask open-ended questions so as not to guide them. Before trust is established, phrasing a question as, how will this help you or not, may compel them to be supportive rather than expressing how it won't actually work for them. As someone working on a product with a third-party risk management use case, I can tell you no matter your industry, someone on your sales team is having to deal with questions about how good your security is, and they have no idea what the answer is. So presenting your vision and your progress towards that vision gives them a differentiator to reference to show that you're truly thinking about security, even if it's far removed from whatever the primary use case that you're selling is. Also connect with product managers like me or whomever is designing whatever your organization offers, even if it's a service. Not only will you benefit by receiving feedback, whether to prioritize or also determine how to implement it, it'll also inspire them to keep you abreast of their own roadmaps. That also benefits you because you'll get a heads up about, oh yeah, we're about to release this new API publicly and blah, 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 blah. You won't be finding out about it that one day before GA. As far as how you present your story, I think some sort of visual aid is generally advisable because then also they can look at it later. If you've seen my slide presentations before, so I don't have any today, but you can likely guess that I tend to expend some sort of effort into visual ideas and how they're presented. I can tell you that the slides that I normally do for conferences are a different level than what I'm presenting internally. You have to be efficient about it. You always have to bear in mind what the listener has to take away. What's the point you're trying to get across, and leave whatever else for voiceover. Bear in mind also that while the technical meat may be a very delicious thing for you, it may be very unappetizing for other people, particularly if they're not technical. Your goal again is to cultivate consensus around your themes, around the journey of your security program, not in the intricate details of the plot. You need to express in accessible terms what the theme is, the value it brings to the organization, and any risks or considerations that will be shared challenges across the organization. Returning to our fairy tale, a slide deck can be presented as follows. Our vision is to reduce the number of vulnerabilities in production. Our goals are to reduce the lead time to deployment, mean time to patch, and security team time spent on security testing. The primary benefit to Organization Inc. is less friction for engineers to test for security vulnerabilities, allowing for our products to be released more quickly. The secondary benefit to the organization is reducing the cost of security testing, helping with scalability as well as freeing up resources to accomplish other security goals. We will need to partner with engineering to understand their workflows and ensure a security testing orchestrator is deployed appropriately into those workflows. We will need to partner with product managers to introduce threat modeling during the design phase, which will require a near-time trade-off for longer-term cost reduction. You begin by inspiring stakeholders, then end with what you need from them to accomplish your goals. This has another benefit of putting those requirements on the radar in advance of when they'll need to execute upon them, resulting in a quicker turnaround time for you. By the end of this prioritization process, I hope you would feel emboldened by the knowledge of which themes are most important to accomplish, and in which order. Now is time to execute, and that means defining what steps you need to take to reach your goal. If you have a program manager, this is exactly where to loop them in. If you can't even loan one from another team just to help out at first, don't pretend to be one. You shouldn't assume you understand the abilities and the constraints of your team members and assign tasks to them without checking with them first. While you can lead the charge on the what, you have to include others in figuring out the how. Look to the real Steve Jobs, not the mythical, fairy prince Steve Jobs. Recall how you trusted that iPhone project lead to actually figure out all of the how around it as long as it met the overall goal for the project. Depending on the size of your team, there will perhaps be only 1 or 2 individuals on it. I know a lot of y'all are resource constrained, but where I see security managers fail is they vacillate between zero direction of feedback and really obsessively getting into the weeds. Through the process I outlined, you've already actually defined the requirements of the project through the need to present it to the rest of the organization. So there isn't necessarily a lot more work that you have to do before people can get started on the how. If you want to really make an impact, begin tackling your security debt. I'm assuming some of you are familiar with technical debt, which is when essentially most of the time quality is sacrificed for speed, typically with the false promise of oh yeah, we're going to totally fix this later once we have time, which is never. Ironically, by not treating security as a product, you are much more likely to accumulate security debt as part of your crusade to integrate your gospel. Embracing security as a product involves treating it almost like a living thing to be nurtured. One which decays and also requires that sort of nurturing and growth to actually stay alive. For each shortcut you take, are you considering what challenges will be created later? Did you document why you can't address it now? For example, is it because there will be a superior way to fix it later on? How frequently are you returning to these shortcuts in that documentation and paying down your debt? There's power in ownership. The endowment effect is a discovery from behavioral econ that people ascribe more value to things they own. Even if you just give them, let's say, a coffee mug, they're going to value that more than a coffee mug on the shelf. And that's far more than they rationally should. Your security program, once it's a product, becomes something that you actually own. It's your vision and it's your story. In a fashion, you can consciously sort of nudge or trick yourself into a mindset that will inherently encourage you to take better care of your security program because you own it. I stress this because a lamentable consequence of the nihilism I see in defenders is that they cease to care about the security of their organization on a time horizon that is beyond when they know that they're going to leave the organization. With the generally kind of tumultuous turnover that we see in security teams, sometimes it's even less than a year, generally 2 or less, if their strategy is security dogma, devotion to it dies whenever the believer leaves. Whatever new zealot comes in is going to implement whatever they want. By creating your vision for the security program, and again as a product, you're describing the map for the security program's journey, for that quest forward. An incoming hero, unburdened by zealotry, can see where they are in the journey and where they're supposed to get to reach the destination. It's unlikely that they stop on the journey, every stop on the journey will actually be completely discarded. They may change a few things, and modulo the fact that if there isn't a lot of evidence, and you kind of fudged evidence, and you still did prioritizing your own opinions, maybe they'll cut it out. What's more likely is that they will change the how, the underlying methods for reaching that destination. So the overarching quest, which is your vision, and to some extent, frankly, your legacy, remains intact. Speaking of switching jobs, the product process actually helps you if you're switching jobs. What is changing is actually the end customer, not the process. Even so, just as when I helped women pick out dresses, there will be customers with characteristics in common to each other, rendering your maps meaningful beyond whatever the initial customer is. And if you want to rise in the ranks, kind of in a security team, or just in general in your security career, the practice of articulating a clear vision and fostering consensus will only serve to demonstrate competency. can demonstrate to your executives or to your board of directors that you understand them as a customer and will nourish their trust in your ability to deftly manage risk in a way that supports the organization's success. So this is the happy ending to my own vision I shared with you today, that you can ride into the sunset knowing you were a hero in a way that actually helped the damsel in distress, or man in distress. It's 2018. So the fanatics who sought to serve spurious justice instead will never reach their dream of some sort of security nirvana. They'll just kind of wail relentlessly into the wind like they do today, or the wind being Twitter, about their persecution at the hands of the locals who just frankly want to prosper. Inspire your organization with your story of how security can allow it to thrive and make them feel like they have a part to play in it. Your band of heroes can and should include your colleagues outside of security, who will be far more willing to aid you in your quest, however long or arduous it may be, if you take the time to discuss its purpose to them from a position of that customer empathy. Security is a product, based on the definition of a product, and reluctance to embrace that fact, to me, is like rejecting scientific evidence in favor of zealotry. There's a way forward that doesn't actually rely on the blessing of the elder InfoSec deities through enforcing security dogma, which I also think that happens to be the path of least resistance, despite being less dictatorial. So quixotism in the name of security purity will crumble as any sort of foundation for that blue utopia I mentioned, but a pragmatic approach, the support of devoted followers, the people in your organization, and a visionary quest might be the right start for our collective journey. So, thank you. Oh, okay, fire alarm.
Just a test, take about 5 seconds. Hold your ears.
Ask questions will have to be after whatever the alarm is. I think we're good. Does anyone have any questions? I think we have like 10 minutes. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It can, as you pointed out, it can definitely be something where it ends up in them just ranting about how annoying security is and blah, blah, blah. It's far better to understand kind of what their general challenges in getting their job done. So almost stopping them at, for example, again, like, oh yeah, just really annoying when the salespeople, like, we're trying to just like log our calls and we have to enter two-factor authentication, and it's like, okay, well, why is the time a problem? Really digging into, like, again, the end result may be that there are disparate systems for both of those, and that if you just unified in one platform, like, you're fine using two-factor. So I think you have to have some level of patience, but I think you can also express, one trick I do is if you kind of want to cut off a rant before it happens, be like, wow, that was a really important point or a really important thought, like, can you explain more about that to me? And so you cut off like them just continuing to ramble, and you're really getting them to dig into, okay, why is that actually a problem? Sometimes, frankly, I think without asking the 5 whys, you'll have people that say like, oh yeah, I hate doing this, but then that's kind of the best way they know how to do it, and it could be only that one person like has that result. So really digging into, and again, like the root cause is more likely to hit on what all of their colleagues have happening to them. So. Yes, exactly. And you can, I mean, I have the fake it till you make it approach, so again, it's like, you can kind of be a jerk in some ways, again, like cutting people off, as long as it seems like you're trying to like better understand them. So like, help me understand is a good approach.
Do you think some of the conflict between security and other groups stems from the fact that companies do have an appetite for risk to some degree. They're willing to let certain things happen, but as an engineer, throughout your lifetime, you really strive to really hit all those marks. Do you think some of that conflict may be due to legal's ability to allow for a certain monetary amount of risk versus the engineer's standpoint of, I want to make this as perfect as I can?
I definitely think that's it. I think it's also, it's almost like in a relationship, like a lack of communication. But on your first point, there are definitely, for example, in critical infrastructure, some of the consulting I've done, when I walk them through that prioritization exercise, they realize their company actually really doesn't care if their customer data gets exposed. Like the fine is so minimal compared to all the other risks they face that like the fact that the security team is like, well, we can't like leave this customer data exposed. Like this is essential because it is everything they've been taught. When one of the other risks happens and the company loses a lot more money, they're like, well, what were you even doing? What security I think fails to do is because, again, you know, it's almost one of those, we find these truths to be self-evident. Like security people know kind of, again, these doctrines so deeply that they don't understand how other people couldn't know. And it's even sometimes when I've presented, for example, ideas from product management or even finance to security people, I take for granted like what I already know and needing to justify and explain like why some things are done the way they are. So again, it's being able to articulate why even it matters to you rather than treating it as some truth everyone knows. The second thing is I think, frankly, I think a lot of people have the luxury that, again, there is a talent shortage, but if you are working at an organization that you know doesn't have customer data as a risk, but that's really important to you, I really think you should consider if that's the right organization to you. It doesn't sound like the right fit. If, you know, protecting, I don't know, like their oil rigs is far more important to them, and like air gapping like all OT systems is what ultimately like is the best value for you, and you don't want to do it, I would say maybe look for employment somewhere else, because ultimately if you're going with the fact that you believe very deeply what's the right thing to do is protect customer data, they're not going to be happy. You aren't really serving the business, you're kind of serving your own sense of morals. See, 5 minutes. Anyone else? I'll also be around. Oh.
Do you have problems with getting people religion? In other words, they don't really understand the security that they be required to have from a regulatory standpoint. It doesn't seem like PCI for dummies or something is going to work. It's like, if they don't quite understand, it's like you're saying, I get this risk, I get this risk, I'll only get my years. How do you overcome, they're just not sophisticated enough? It's sort of like, people up with a pen test or something. It's like if they're not tall enough to ride this rise, how do you bring people forth on it? Well, that was his idea.
So I mean, one thing I'm working on, even like on my own personal product roadmap, is I fundamentally think like the language of business is money, and speaking in terms of money, I do think can help. The way I would phrase it too, if the overall fine, like I think HIPAA fines are what capped it, something, it's low 7 figures, which to some organizations is kind of low, but saying like, okay, your 1 minute of not bothering to do this has now cost $4 million, like do you really want to think of it that way? So I think trying to, I mean, I think we all know kind of in the news and everywhere else, like people massage statistics and they make statistics work for them. I would say do the same thing, like big scary numbers, like in red, like this is the loss you will experience based on like this particular action, I think is useful. Again, that cause and effect, I think what I see way too often is security people say kind of like the general security risk of this will definitely result in a breach that will cost this. It's like, no, tie it to specifically like where in the workflows, like exactly what they need to do in order to reduce that risk. So again, using two-factor, like making sure to use a password manager, like make it very specific and very straightforward things they can do, not just like always consider security when you're like printing something or whatever else.
Not abstract.
Yeah, exactly. Because you will understand if someone says like, oh yeah, make sure to secure your device, you're like, yeah, I can assume like it's this number of steps. They're gonna have no idea, but if you tell them like, make sure to have like a password on boot, like find some way to help them do that with documentation or something else, like it'll be a lot easier for them.
Sort of along those lines, have you ever experienced times where different teams are using different kinds of solutions on the
Yeah, there's like sort of, this mic keeps like shrinking down. Here we go. There's sort of another talk like secretly embedded in here, which is that I think at some point the DevOps and security movements are actually going to intersect because they're all trying to measure and improve the same things, often fundamentally, and the same sort of processes benefit both. So I think they are using different language right now, but fundamentally they're often trying to optimize for the same things because security problems, particularly any disruption to like uptime, is going to be horrible for their metrics. Again, I do think that security people, there's no real, I feel like, standard ontology in security, but again, we think about it in terms of like, what's the risk, like what's the potential impact, but it's rarely in, again, financial terms, and rarely like, I feel like truly in depth as far as probabilistic risk. So for example, like there was recently some vulnerability in like, I think it was the Schneider Electric like management system. I was talking to a journalist about it, and the business impact is basically like, yes, you will gain access to the system, but you still have to understand how to blow up an oil rig. Like this doesn't help you figure out how all of the complex protocols to blow up the oil rig. It just helps you get on like the system and then find a way to maybe pivot onto the oil rig itself. What it did is basically provide a way into business systems. So security people will be like, it's an RCE, this is absolutely critical, like it allows access onto our networks. From the business perspective, it's like, there's still kind of this other hurdle before it really causes damage to us. So I think, again, going back to the monetary risk is really where you will kind of, it's like this universal language, I feel like, across all teams. So that's why I emphasize that. But I would really say, like, if you do have a like DevOps or engineer team, like try to talk to them, explain what your problems are, and be like, how do you describe it? And just try to learn and vice versa. I think is that 0 or 1 minute?
1.
It's 1, okay. It's very like sexy mood lighting, so I can't really see it. What? Oh, okay. That's why. Any final questions? Otherwise I'll be around. Awesome, thank you.